Previously on a Scowl Method podcast. Especially if you're older, right? We're getting, like, our population in general is getting older, right? So I can't imagine, look, like I said, y'all know what my goal is. I want to be the flyest 75-year-old that ever existed, right? There's a process that I got to take to get there, though. That process includes a lot of picking metal plates up and putting them down, right? But I see that and I want to be that because I want to move well at 75. I want to be well at 75. A large part of being well, a large part of longevity is strength. And remember what strength is. So, go back to my wellness episode or whatever, but it's just like strength is simply your ability to activate your nervous system to move. All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to episode number 28 of the Scowl Method podcast. This episode 28, is about phantom stiffness. Now, that's a kind of a strange term there, but listen, this topic was actually kind of in the making for a while now, and it started to come up a little bit. So let me just break this story down a little bit real quick, right? So initially, I noticed, like, I train a lot of clients who start their workouts out like very, very stiff, very tight, right? And then, it kind of eases up as they get to the middle of the workout, kind of like standard stuff, right? So it's just like, that got me thinking a little bit, because it even happened to me, on occasion as well, where I would start the workout really, really stiff. But then by the time I got to the middle of the workout, I was perfectly fine. But the thing about it is, for myself, I was stiff, but I wasn't really missing any range of motion, rather, right? So like I wasn't kind of doing partial reps or anything like that. I was stiff, but I still had a full range of motion. I was tight in other places, but I didn't experience any pain. And this is what I noticed for a lot of my clients as well. What happens is, like, they'll say, like, I'm tight here, but they're doing full range of motion squats. Like, and it was like, and I always ask, like, do you feel any pain associated with it? No pain. It's just tight. Okay. And it was like, and then it'll work itself out later on. Okay, cool. Right. So, I mentioned before that I was taking peptides, right? I was enrolled in whatever. I'm in a peptide therapy program. So, one of the peptides I took actually was thymosin beta 4, and there's research that says that peptide in particular is really good. Well, thymosin beta 4 and thymosin alpha 1, I think is what it is. But those two peptides are really good in terms of, well, let me not oversell it. There's research that suggests that these peptides can improve the communication between cells. Now, why am I mentioning this right now? Because I prior to taking thymosin beta 4, I would wake up, stiff joints, stiff muscles. I would start my workouts, stiff joints, stiff muscles, and things would be a little uncomfortable. Mind you, still wasn't really missing any range of motion or anything like that, and there wasn't any pain. It was just, tightness. After taking the thymosin beta 4 for a little bit, I realized that the tightness went away. And it was interesting because, like, if the tightness and the stiffness came from actual, muscle mechanical tightness and stiffness, then that's one thing. That's where it's like stretching would help out, right? But I remember there was a point in time where I would feel stiff and tight, and I would stretch, and no improvement at all whatsoever, right? So, and I would stretch consistently every night, and I would just still feel tight. So that got me thinking and researching, thinking and researching and talking to people about this stuff, right? So I'm like, all right, so is there a pathway in which you could feel tight but not actually be tight? And throughout all the research and all that fun stuff, throughout all the conversations, that's an obvious yes. So in what situations would you feel that? So I'm going to go over all of that stuff as we go along, but that's the starting point for this particular topic. Myself, whole bunch of clients tend to feel tight and stiff. Before I took thymosin beta 4, I was tight and stiff. Not so much anymore. And I'm saying that's because of the communication between the cells has improved. But what does that mean, right? So we'll get there, right? What's going on, everybody? Hope you're doing well out there. I'm Coach Evan. This is Say Cheese and Lift Studio, and you're listening to the Scout Method Podcast, your one-stop shop for not only physical fitness, but mental fitness, emotional fitness, and spiritual fitness. All right, let's get to it. Let's do it. You ever feel stiff and you go to exercise, but you have full range of motion? Or you ever feel tight, but there's no pain and your muscles and joints move freely? You just might be suffering from phantom stiffness. Now, look, what is phantom stiffness? All right, let's get to it, right? Phantom stiffness, in a fancy definition way, right? With a fancy definition, is the sensation of tightness, tension, or immobility in the body, even when there's no physical or structural limitation. Okay? It's mainly an issue of the protective output of the nervous system. So again, we'll break it down a little bit more, right? Phantom stiffness is you feel the stiffness, you feel the tightness, but there's nothing actually stiff or tight about your muscles or joints. And this is mainly a nervous system output. And there's a few reasons why your nervous system would respond in this way, okay? Okay, so the first thing, or the first, I guess, kind of general category, or first reason why we would feel this or experience this phenomena of phantom stiffness is because of neurological perception and sensitization, right? Now that's another mouthful. It's another fancy term, but basically what it says is it basically tells us that sometimes our nervous system gets the wires crossed a little bit, for lack of better terms, and it happens. And here's the thing, right? It could happen to anyone at any point in time, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that's like a chronic issue. Now, it could be a chronic issue, right? So, essentially, sometimes the wires get crossed, right? But the interesting thing was, there's a study that was done that took patients with amputations, who had amputations because of rheumatoid arthritis. And I think this study was actually done for another reason, but they found out some other things concerning, our central nervous system during this study, right? So they tested the central nervous system, or CNS, involvement, and throughout the disease, basically throughout the lifespan of the disease, right? And what they found was that these patients felt stiffness in their limbs, the ones that weren't there, right? So they felt stiffness in the limbs that were amputated. And that what that tells us is our central nervous system, there's some neuroplasticity with our central nervous system, meaning it can learn, it could grow, it can build these pathways. It's going to act like, and it's going to basically respond as if you still have that limb. It's the same thing that goes on with phantom pain, right? You get an amputation, but you still feel pain in that limb. It's the same thing. So your central nervous system is kind of the culprit here when it comes to phantom stiffness, right? So what happens is our brains will interpret or misinterpret signals that are coming from our muscles and our joints, and then that'll lead to a subjective feeling of stiffness. Again, without there ever being a mechanical issue or a structural issue. So again, this is more of a topic or more of a situation of like an overactive nervous system. Maybe not overactive, but it's just like it's sending these signals when there doesn't need to be a signal sent. But there's also some protective reasons for that happening as well. So let's dig in a little bit here, because like how does this happen in the first place, right? So your muscles and your joints, they have receptors, nervous receptors that send small electrical signals through the nerves back to the brain, okay? So they fire off these little signals whenever you stretch. They fire off these little signals whenever you contract, whenever you flex the muscle, right? They also send off little signals to detect, so your joints will have these receptors as well that'll send off these signals that will detect pressure, a shearing force, stretch, same thing, ideal. So things like that. So any real movement of the muscle or the joints, these receptors will send a electrical signal back to your brain. Okay, keep that in mind. That is very important. All right. So these basically, where things get mixed up is like the signal. So the signal could come over incorrectly, right? So the signal can either come over too loud, where it's just like, hey, look, your muscles are sending this, the nervous receptors in your muscle are sending this signal to your brain, basically to say like, hey, look, we're tight over here. There's some structural damage. So they're sending this, firing off this electrical pulse basically too loud. And so your brain is basically responding based on that, right? So it could be too loud, meaning the receptors will send a signal that is amplified, and it's amplified based on what the normal sensations are. So like it's, if you're moving your arm as I'm moving my arm right now, I'm just bending at the elbow, right? In essence, I'm not really flexing anything. I'm just kind of moving, right? I'm not lifting 800 pounds, but the muscles in my elbow joint will send a signal as if I'm lifting like 1,000 pounds. And that's when its signal comes over too loud, right? I hope I'm making sense here. Right? And then what will happen is it will cause the nervous system to, because what happens whenever let's just say you lift too much, right? And you're trying not to rip the muscle and to break the joint, your body will protect itself. So what happens is if I'm moving here and the signals are going out as if I'm lifting 800 pounds, well, then my body is going to say, or my brain is going to basically say, hey, shut this down. You're not going to be able to lift this much freely. So then a signal goes back, and that's where the feeling of stiffness and tightness comes from. So it's more of a protective measure so that you don't destroy the muscle or the joint. But this process is one of the processes that happens a lot after a stress or injury to the area, right? So let's say you pull a muscle and then you heal and recover from the muscle, but then you realize that you don't have the same range of motion, even though there's no pain. And it's like that's your body kind of protecting you from getting to that range of motion again so that you don't injure yourself again, even though the injury risk might be very, very, very low. All right. So we can also feel phantom stiffness through psychological and emotional factors. And this is also this is a big one too, right? Because stress, anxiety, any heightened emotion, even depression can cause heightened awareness and could turn into phantom stiffness, right? In this case, the stiffness is more of a response to emotional or mental stress than it is a change in muscular or joint structure, okay? So you can imagine a way in which, let me put it this way. People who go through trauma often wear it. People who go through trauma often feel it in their bodies, right? They feel it in things getting tightened up. Think about it this way. Let's just say you had a stressful day at work. And where's the first place you feel it? Maybe the back of your neck, maybe lower back. And that's all tightness, stiffness, all that fun stuff. But that's your body reacting to the stress, right? Because then you might not even have an injury at all. You might not, there might not be any structural change at all whatsoever. It's just you went to work, they ticked you off that day, and then all of a sudden everything is tight. That's the mental and emotional side of this, of this phenomenon is very interesting. And it's pretty valid too, because it's like, again, you talk to people who've been through stuff and they often experience it in their physical bodies as well. It's an interesting thing, very interesting thing. So there's also this process called muscle guarding, okay? And this process is one where muscles will slightly contract to prevent pain, essentially, right? And this doesn't necessarily mean the muscles are mechanically stiff. Rather, the nervous system will or your brain will basically tell your muscles to tighten up a little bit to protect the body from a perceived threat or injury. Okay, and with that, there's this other study that showed people who reported chronic back stiffness, right? And they did this study on a whole bunch of people that reported chronic back stiffness, and what they found was that none of these people actually had stiffer spines than the people who didn't report it. So it's just like, it was just very interesting. This is an example of muscle guarding in which the brain overestimates pressure to discourage movement. So that happens pretty often too, right? So, and it happens especially after you had injury or something like that. Like, a lot of these things happen because of prior injury, and you think like, well, I'm not completely healed yet because I'm still so stiff. And that might not necessarily be the case, right? So we go through, so this idea of muscle guarding is a pretty interesting one, right? And this one is more likely to happen than not, right? And even when there was no injury present. So, there's times where your body will, so those nervous receptors in the joints and in the muscle will fire off a little bit more when you have this idea of like, well, you're going to get injured here, right? And the crazy part is this mixes with the mental or the psychological or the emotional stress as well, right? Because there was this group of studies that was done on just like the psychology of training and the psychology of exercising, and as an aside, this is why trainers are still so important. I will continue to say this: why good trainers are really important in helping the masses get to where they need to get to. So, that'll be the only time I say that this episode, I hope. Right? But there's an idea that, let's just say, I'll give you a silly example, squatting with your knees over your toes, back in the day, that was a big no-no. And then it's not so much a no-no now, right? Like, there are more studies that came out that said that it was like, well, it's not really that bad, but you have to be prepared for it in this way, right? But that was a rule of thumb. You never squat with your knees over your toes, right? So now tell that to a person who's just starting out training, and let's just say they're doing their squats and all that fun stuff, and they're squatting, and they've been told never to squat with your knees over your toes, or you'll do what? You'll injure yourself, right? So now you suggest, hey, look, I want you to squat with your knees over your toes, and all of a sudden they feel stiff. And all of a sudden their range of motion kind of shortens up a little bit without any structural thing going on, without any injury happening. None of that stuff actually happened. But they've been told over and over again, never squat with your knees over your toes or you're going to injure yourself. And when they go to do that, they automatically get to a point. So the mental, psychological side is already kicking in strong and saying like, hey, look, you shouldn't do that because, right? So that muscle guarding happens when there's an idea or when there's a perceived threat or perceived chance of injury, right? There you go, right? So even from the emotional side, you say like, fear most often shows up in our bodies. I mean, whenever you're scared of something, you tend to shrink, right? You tend to tighten up, right? Same thing with anger. Anger tends to make people tighten up as well. So any heightened emotional thing, you tighten up. But that's part of the muscle guarding. Right. So it happens from a physical perspective, from a physiological perspective, from a psychological perspective, and from an emotional perspective. Right. So that happens probably more often than even I thought. But, there's another process that happens with where it's not a full on injury, but it's micro damage, micro tears in the muscles or in the joints. And then the body is just doing what it does and protects itself, right, from further harm or for actually like blowing the whole thing out, right? That one's a little bit more understandable because there's actually some difference in the joint or the muscle. That one's a little bit, I get that one a little bit more, right? But what happens is like the inflammation and micro damage to the muscles. Well, I just talked about the micro damage. I didn't even talk about the inflammation yet. We'll get there. But the micro damage to the muscles and the joints can cause phantom stiffness, but only if there isn't really any major structural changes, right? And no measurable loss of range of motion. And that's the thing, right? Like, the little micro damage, little micro tears, working out does that, right? And you might get the DOMS after that. You're more likely to be limited because of the pain, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean the muscles aren't able to do that range of motion, able to move. It doesn't necessarily mean that the joints aren't able to move freely. It's just your brain stopping your body, stopping you from doing it, right? Now, on the other end, inflammation, and you know how I feel about inflammation in general, right? I don't see it as good or bad, but it's a response to something, right? And that something is good or bad. Okay? Inflammation can also cause you to tighten up, right? So you get a whole bunch of inflammation to a particular area. You're getting inflammation to the area for a reason because it needs the nutrients, it needs some proper healing, it needs something. Something needs to be cleaned out, whatever it may be. So what your body will do is send a signal like, hey, we need to protect this area even more because there's inflammation present. But that's why also inflammation, when it's coming from bad sources, that's why we want to stamp that down as much as possible. Okay? Because let's just say you have inflammation because of a terrible diet. Now you're inflamed everywhere. So your mind or your brain is constantly sending that signal to the rest of your body to basically say, tighten up. We can't move. We shouldn't move because we need to protect all of these areas. That is a bad state to be in. That is a terrible state to be in. And it could potentially cause injury and more pain. So it was like, you want to be very mindful of the sources of inflammation that you have there and be mindful of the balance of inflammation that you have in your body, right? And there's ways to do that. I've talked about that almost ad nauseum, right? So there's ways to figure out like what your balance of inflammation is. There's ways to stamp out the bad inflammation, right? There's ways to continue on and move quickly through the good inflammation, right? But that's the thing. Inflammation in this sense is almost doubly worse, if I could use that phrase at all, right? So look, there's also consider someone who has been someone's been injured in general. So like now we're talking about in the case of injury, they're more likely to interpret these signals as or interpret the normal signals as stiffness, right? Again, because of all of those other things that I listed before, right? So what amplifies this is that this could be like there's also this, and this is where the mental side kicks in yet again. There's this expectation that you're going to be stiff. Therefore, you're going to be stiff. It's like the self-fulfilling prophecy here, right? So it's like you got injured, busted your hamstring, and it's just like, all right, well, I'm a heel, but the hamstring isn't going to be the same. It's always going to be tight. It's always going to be this, so on and so forth. Well, yeah, it is, because you think it's going to be. You get what I'm saying? So there's part of your body is already, without you really knowing it, protecting that area, right? But now you're consciously doing it as well. So it's, of course, there's going to be some stiffness. And the structure might have already healed. The joints and everything around that might have already healed. So there might not be anything wrong structurally at all whatsoever, but you're still, and this is what some people say, you're still babying it, right? Like there's a point at which you're going to have to kind of, step up, move on a little bit, right? So, I guess my main point overall here is that stiffness and tightness doesn't always equal a structural or a mechanical problem. It doesn't necessarily mean it's an issue with your muscles or joints. It often stems from, though, a neural interpretation and not necessarily tissue tightness. Okay? So how do you recognize this stuff? How can you tell the difference between actual tightness and phantom tightness, right? There are a few ways to do it. I have a few tips for you here, okay? So how do you recognize the difference, and maybe not even a difference? How do you recognize when it's phantom stiffness and when there's something actually wrong, right? When there's an issue, right? Now, there's not, I can't give you the exact way to do it without scans, right? But I can give you some tips that will help you kind of delineate between the two, right? And one of them really comes down to, and actually they all kind of come down to different parts of your being. Again, that's why we have this topic on the Scout method. All right, so let's start with your mind and let's start with your thinking here, right? The question is when you got to start asking not the question is, but you got to start asking some of these questions when you experience that stiffness. And it's so one of the main questions, right, is this stiffness consistent, or does it change when I'm distracted, right? And that's a mental thing here, right? So it's do you notice when and I guess what this is asking you to do, and what I'm asking you to do here is to determine and kind of analyze the times that you are feeling that stiffness. What else is going on with you, right? Are you under some psychological stress? Are you under some emotional stress? Do you have some ideas that are going to hinder your progress or hinder your range of motion, right? So it's things like that. So we're going to start with the thinking, because, phantom stiffness from your thinking often shows up when you're overthinking a movement or anticipating some type of pain or injury, right? Go back to the example that I gave you concerning squatting with your knees over your toes. So don't do it or you'll get injured. So you're thinking automatically you're going to get injured with something like this. So your body's going to protect itself. So that stiffness is going to pop up because of that, because of your thinking already. Because of what you were taught, right, at that point. But it's whatever that thought process is, that's what's causing you to tighten up when it's not an actual structural issue, right? Same thing so when it goes to your heart, emotional stress, anxiety, and trauma can present as bodily restriction, which, I mentioned before already, especially trauma. Trauma comes out in your body all the time. Like it's just you move differently when you go through trauma. And that's, yeah, I'm not going to dig too deep into that one, but it's just one thing I've noticed that over the years, trauma victims move in a particular way. And I don't know, and you have to, I'm not saying I'm super astute or anything like that. It's just something I noticed. They definitely move in a different way, especially those who have dealt with that trauma and dealt with the issues and dealt with things. They move differently as well. So you could, I don't know, maybe I'm just the only nutcase that can tell, but you can tell. Yeah. And so then it's like if the actual if the phantom stiffness is coming from like just bodily restrictions in general, right? So we covered the mind, we covered the heart, and now it's the body. If it's coming from your body, a good way to kind of stave that off is just, some simple mobility routines, right? And move your way through those. Move your way through mobility routines. Move your way through some breath work. Breath work is great in general. It's great for your health. Some breath work to bring you down, to relax and everything like that. I do breath work before I go to sleep. It leads to great sleeps. Although, and not all the time, but that's for other reasons. So anyway, yeah, it's, you basically mobility routines and some breath work. That's why typically a lot of people will suggest things like yoga. And I'm not the biggest fan of yoga. I just got to be straight up with you. I'm not the biggest fan of yoga. Again, I'm a Pilates guy, right? Love some Pilates. There is a form of Pilates that you could do that's a little bit more or a little bit less strenuous, I guess, is what you want to call it. But just being able to get that stretch out, those stretched out positions, get that mobility in, it's really good for your body to avoid this idea of phantom stiffness, right? And then it's like with your spirit, with your soul, how do you recognize phantom stiffness and how does it present? Like, what does that have to do with your soul? And the best way I can explain this is sometimes that you get spiritually blocked up, and that shows up in your body as well. And so I was just thinking about, there's a situation where, like, especially on a spiritual side, a guilty person also moves differently as well. That might be a whole another episode. I'm gonna leave that there though. But there's certain things that you want to be able to, from a spiritual side, line up, because I'm of the belief that there's nothing that happens in the physical realm that doesn't happen in the spiritual realm first, or some type of movement in the spiritual realm first. That's it. Like that's what I believe though, right? So a lot of times what happens in your body can be charted to a spiritual issue, right? Not all the time, and I'm not going to be one of those guys who are just like, it's all due to your spirit and to your soul. Like I'm not there, but I will say that when there's a spiritual struggle, it often appears as phantom stiffness. And it's like all of a sudden things are just tight. Everything, you're not moving as well. It's just like you kind of hemmed up spiritually. So that's kind of how, like, you want to ask those questions whenever you experience that stiffness, you want to kind of go through the scan. You want to go through that check, right? So it's like, okay, how am I mentally? How am I emotionally? How am I spiritually, right? And how am I physically, right? So I would probably save the physical part for the last part, right? Because it's just like, if there's no pain or anything like that, and it's like, well, why is this phantom stiffness here then? Why am I feeling stiff? I would go over that checklist of other things, other aspects of your life to see if there's something there. A lot of times, at least for me personally, it's been just the psychological stress, right? Or well, no, the psychological stress, or somebody really just ticked me off and I'm just tight. Right. So, I mean, that's just telling the truth. Right. So, but then once you figure out what it is, you have to kind of go through the process of like, and this is a tough one, right? So once you figure out where the stiffness comes from, you kind of have to coach yourself on the opposite a little bit, right? So it's just like, okay, I'm tight because I had a stressful day. So this is all because of stress, right? Okay, so now you have to tell yourself, you kind of have to look at things differently. At one point, you have to utilize your reframing skills. And I talked about that during the critical thinking episode, the sound mind episode, that whole thing, reframing, or wait, I think I talked about that during the sound heart episode as well. So reframing things, everything, it allows you a little bit more freedom. Honestly, it allows you more freedom to be able to do, to do stuff, right? So let's think about it this way. You've gone through an injury, right? So it was like you're going through an injury of some sort, and you obviously don't want to do it again, but you almost have to tell yourself, instead of saying like, hey, look, if I do this movement, I'm going to get injured again. It's like, how about I better prepare my body to be able to withstand this, right? Or how about I better prepare my body? Now, granted, some movements you shouldn't do in the first place, right? You shouldn't do. And that's individual, right? Individualistic, right? Based on your makeup, based on your physiology, there might be some movements that you should absolutely not do. That's fine. Then don't do them, right? But it shouldn't stop you from doing any movement at all, right? So you might end up trying to do a movement. For instance, let's just say you hurt yourself on a deadlift, and now you start to feel tightness in your back whenever you do seated rows. Well, you shouldn't feel tightness in your back when you're doing seated rows. So you kind of have to tell yourself, hey, look, this is not a deadlift. I'm not doing a deadlift. What I'm doing is a seated row. My back is protected. I'm good to go. Let's roll. Right. And I know it sounds kind of cheesy and a little corny, but you kind of have to coach yourself in that way, mentally coach yourself to be able to drive forward and continue on and to continue to grow, right? Because you don't want to stall either, right? And honestly, during my workouts, that's what I do all the time. I'm coaching myself up during my workouts. I'm talking to myself. I know that sounds crazy, but I'm talking to myself. It's like, no, you have the free look. Last episode, I was talking about how like I'm able to do things that a lot of people can't do. I don't take that for granted. So I'm always talking to myself about, hey, look, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're moving through. You're good, you got it, you're protected, right? You're safe. That's another thing, right? So from an emotional side, from a mental side a little bit as well, and from a physiological side, you're doing movements. You have to be able to tell yourself that these movements are safe, and you have to be able to tell yourself that you are safe in the arena that you're doing this in. That's a way to kind of reframe some of the mental stress, the emotional stress that you get, even from the physical stress that you would get. You got to be able to feel and understand that you're safe and far from injury, right? And or free from injury, right? And that's a way to kind of ease up or ease away from the whole idea of phantom stiffness, right? You got to give your body not even like the permission, but sometimes in some cases, the permission to move freely. Right. So that's what I would do. Right. And, of course, you can use like visualizations and things like that. You can imagine, one of the famous, visualizations is like when Arnold was talking about, he was doing bicep curls, and he was like, he just imagined the peaks of mountains on his arms. And it's just like, that's, visualization is a powerful technique. So in this case, when dealing with phantom stiffness and dealing with feeling restricted or being restricted because of other reasons besides actual joint or muscle structural limitations, you almost can imagine something different, right? Imagine that you're water. Like, be like water, Bruce Lee said, right? So it's just like, imagine that you're water, you're free flowing, you're moving, right? and you're feeling those movements and you're enjoying those movements and you're safe to do those movements. Things like that count for a lot. And again, I know it sounds like foo-foo. I know it sounds like, but don't discount how important visualization is to your success overall. Okay? Now, I basically think that's a wrap. I think we covered the topic here, right? So it's like phantom stiffness, not a great thing. It happens because of a few reasons. It breaks down into mostly a neurological thing, a neurological issue, because if there's no structural damage, if there's nothing wrong with the actual muscles or the joints, then it really comes down to your CNS, or in the signals that are getting sent back and forth between the muscles, the joints, and your brain. All right. There are ways to ease that up. There are ways to, and I'm not even talking about like a quick fix. There are ways let me backtrack. Because of the neuroplasticity of your nervous system in general, right? Like your nervous system can learn and relearn, right? So because it can do that, these tips and tricks over the long term would actually get you to being, moving freely. And you wouldn't feel that stiffness anymore. Phantom stiffness doesn't stay forever, right? Even after injury, right? There's a way to move on past that and continue to improve upon your movement, okay? So take those tips, run with them. Let me know how it goes. I know some of them are a little, like, it requires a lot of thinking. It requires some soul searching too, believe it or not. And, and I know that that's not the easiest process for a lot of people, but give it a shot. Let me know what you think, what you come up with. All right. All right, there it is. There you have it, folks. Episode 28 in the books. Phantom stiffness. Phantom stiffness. What was it? What is it? Why you want to avoid it? And how you can do so. Right. It's a very interesting, very strange kind of phenomenon, but not one without its solutions. Okay, so give all those tips a shot, and like I said, let me know how you do. Let me know if there's any questions or anything like that. Our bodies are so interesting. They're so interesting, and they move, and it's just such an interesting thing. And it's sometimes a hard concept to grasp that we have these little things, these little cells inside of our body that communicate with each other, hopefully properly, and then allow us to do different things in whatever arena that we're in. It's just like, it's sometimes just such a hard concept to grasp and fully understand. But one thing that is not very difficult for me to do, at least, is to appreciate it. And it's just an amazing thing to be able to move, to think, to be. Like, that's, nah. So I'm not going to go down this road, too much, because I could do this for a couple hours again. But it's just like, I'm amazed at what our bodies can do. And sometimes I'm amazed at, like, how we can sometimes think our way and feel our way into trouble. But we can also think and feel our way out of trouble, right? And it's just our bodies are so interesting. Our bodies are so interesting. I'm starting to ramble, so I'm going to call it right now. But it's just, our bodies are so interesting. Well, listen, I'm Coach Evan. This is Say Cheese and Lift Studio. And you just got finished listening to the Scowl Method Podcast, your one-stop shop for not only physical fitness, but mental fitness, emotional fitness, and spiritual fitness. Hopefully, we'll see you on the next episode. Y'all stay tuned. We're going to keep doing this now.